Crawford must be very busy indeed if he is recruiting help from the student body. Busy hunting that new one, Buffalo Bill. What a naughty boy he is. Do you know why he's called Buffalo Bill? Please tell me. The newspapers won't say.
Well, it started as a bad joke in Kansas City homicide. They said, this one likes to skin his humps.
Why do you think he removes their skins, Agent Stein? Thrown with your action.
It excites him. Most serial killers keep some sort of trophies from their victims.
I didn't.
No, you ate yours.
Ritual is embedded in our daily lives. Culture, identity, even routine tasks are ritualized. Rituals are repetitive forms of behavior acted out to achieve positive outcomes and traditionally underpinned by religious beliefs. Historically, religious rituals include witch hunts, exorcisms, and animal-human sacrifice. Cases of these rituals still occur, though usually illegally. Public forms of religious ritual in contemporary societies can include Christmas and funerals. Ritual also embodies a form of crime. Dawn Perlmutter describes ritual crime as any act of violence characterized by a series of repeated physical, sexual, and/or psychological actions, combined with a systematic use of symbols, ceremonies, and/or machinations. The need to repeat such acts can be cultural, sexual, economic, psychological, and/or spiritual. While not perfect, as emphasis is on violent crime, it interestingly moves away from rational action theories towards cultural criminological understandings, highlighting emotions and culture as core aspects of crime. Perlmutter's definition includes violent ritual crimes like rape, genocide, and serial homicide. For example, particular aspects of sexual serial murder relate to Perlmutter's idea of ritual crime. Modus operandi, symbolism through choice of victim and weapon, and post-mortem activity such as necrophilia and cannibalism transforms the murder into a ceremony where specialized behavioral patterns are repeated in order to achieve pleasure and sexual gratification. Furthermore, serial murders are exposed in wider society, both as acts epitomizing evil, where serial killers such as Ted Bundy and Ed Gein emerge as archetypal boogeymen representing our most iniquitous fears, but also as topics of fascination, sometimes fetishization, engage in our morbid curiosities and most arcane fantasies, where serial killers become subjects worthy of our study and admiration. This shows that violent ritual crime has become a visible, influential facet in our culture and society. Having determined what comprises ritual crime, it is important to investigate what motivates ritual criminals. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer is interesting because it encompasses a rare form of crime and a seemingly normal perpetrator. 23rd of July, 1991. Police raid the apartment of Jeff Dahmer following allegations of attempted murder. What they find shocks the world. Polaroids of brutal dismemberment on the coffee table, a human head in the fridge, and preserved genitalia in the closet. The preceding confession is equally startling, documenting a killing spree spanning over a decade in which at least 17 young men are raped and murdered. To add a horrifying twist, cannibalism, necrophilia, and zombification all enter Dahmer's confession. Dubbed the Milwaukee Cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer became not merely associated with evil, but the apparent embodiment of evil itself. Dahmer's crimes were obviously transgressive, but also incredibly ritualistic. Jeff's fascination with viscera began as a young child, where he collected the bones of dead animals. As he grew older, Jeff's fascination evolved into actively dissecting roadkill and dissolving their remains with chemicals. This became a ritualized method for disposing of corpses, entwined with feelings of pleasure, and was a precursor for behavior performed on his human victims. The pleasurable emotions, bound up with Jeff's childhood experiments, became a more crucial and more intense aspect in his MO, where dismemberment was a major part of the killing process, which incorporated acts such as posing the corpses for photographs or into sculptures, and masturbating while dismembering the corpses. As Jeff became more comfortable with killing, he started practicing activities inextricably linked with using the victim's corpse for sexual gratification, such as cannibalism and necrophilia, and later into his career as a serial killer, Dahmer began dabbling with ideas of occultism, where he planned to build a temple out of the preserved remains of his victims. Jeffrey therefore developed intricate rituals around disposing of the corpses, and later incorporated sexually gratifying acts into these processes, meaning that his post-mortem activities weren't merely means-ends methods of cleaning up to evade discovery, but were also highly irrational and pleasure-seeking. Drugging was also symbolic to Jeffrey, who wanted a living partner of whom he had complete sexual control over and could prevent from leaving him. This process of drugging his victim later transgressed to zombification, where Jeffrey would drill holes into the skulls of some of his later victims and inject either hydrochloric acid or boiling water into their brains in a bid to keep them alive, but in a submissive state. The experiments did not succeed, and Dahmer's victims died within 24 hours of being drugged. Psychologists analysed Dahmer's past to determine whether he was legally insane, but on February the 15th, 1992, the jury found Jeffrey Dahmer guilty and sane. Society was stumped. How could someone sane commit such atrocities? Even more puzzling was his background. He came from a white, middle-class American family. His father had a PhD, and Jeff attended university before dropping out and training as a military medic. There was no evidence of childhood abuse, and only contrasting accounts of neglect. His background defied traditional notions of what created a violent criminal. Psychologists emphasized emotional neglect, theorizing that limited emotional connection shared with his mother caused Jeff to develop severe abandonment anxiety. This impeded on his ability to establish and maintain lasting relationships. Thus, he cannibalized his partners to keep them permanently with him. The Rothenberg cannibal Armin Mivers described similar motives for cannibalism, which supports the abandonment anxiety thesis. However, other psychological explanations, such as alcoholism and paraphilia, are less convincing and don't provide full answers. Therefore, Dahmer's psychological state must be brought into the social context it existed in. The 1960s and 70s was a time of rapid social change. Conservative pre-60s social values were being replaced by secular ideals centered on equal rights. Growing up amidst this era, Jeff would have been exposed to competing sets of values, traditional ideals in the home, and radical views from wider society. Coupled with his parents' dysfunctional marriage, Jeff would have lacked a stable environment and felt only partially integrated within the home and wider society. The conflicting messages would have likely caused further confusion in the already disturbed mind of a young, isolated Dahmer. When at 15, he realized he was gay, more conflict would have entered Jeff's consciousness, further warping the development of his thoughts and behaviors. Durkheim terms confusion resulting from lowly regulated and integrated societies as anomie, where a lack of stable norms and values leads to extreme individualization and limited social cohesion, which causes societal breakdown as individuals lose their sense of moral direction and become hedonistic. From a Durkheimian perspective, Dahmer could commit his crimes, even while sane, by feeling apathetic towards the needs of his victims, which meant that he wasn't deterred by feelings of guilt and concern over their well-being. Similarly, Nietzsche suggests, with his apocalyptic statement, Gott ist tot, that as society becomes more secular, humans no longer fear going to hell, and thus are not deterred from committing crimes traditionally considered to be damned, thus creating the Übermensch, or people who create their own values because there are few or no consequences to fear.
Accountable to anybody. I didn't feel that I had to face what I had done ever. if a person doesn't think that there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway.
But what draws people to deviancy as an alternative? Freud states that the sexual life of civilized man has been seriously damaged. Civilization restricts natural sexual urges found in normal human beings through norms and values which denounce sexual acts not categorized as monogamous and heterosexual as being perverse and abnormal. Consequently, Eros, the sex drive, is perpetually in conflict with social sanctions, thus leading to psychological disorder in some individuals or an inability to chastise natural urges in others. Conversely, Kevin Haggerty identifies society in producing values which relate to modern serial killing. He states that modern phenomena, including anonymity, rationality, and the mass media, provide the key institutional frameworks, motivations, and opportunity structures characteristic of contemporary forms of serial killings. A key aspect of this is how society designates certain groups for abuse through stigmatic social structuralization. Dahmer's victims were mostly gay ethnic minority men. Haggerty argues that this gave Dahmer opportunities to kill with a minimal risk of police investigating missing victims due to the institutionalized racism and homophobia within the police force, which produced an unwillingness for involvement in ethnic and gay missing person cases. Moreover, stigmatized groups are devalued, making it seem more acceptable and palatable to kill them because they are portrayed by society as inferior. This makes it easier for murderers to emotionally distance themselves from victims chosen from these groups, which might explain why popular target groups for serial killers include prostitutes, the homeless, young women, and gay men. It's unlikely that Jeffrey Dahmer was born a pure monster destined to kill. The sick mind and morbid fantasies of Jeff, along with the rise of individualist hedonism, was a match made in hell, especially when placed in a cultural environment which allowed Jeffrey's career in serial killing to flourish. The Milwaukee Cannibal was therefore a product of psychological, sociological, and cultural forces. As we have seen, the practice of ritual has existed practically as early as humanity itself, from the earliest burials to nights out and music festivals. Ritual also has a darker side, in historical religious practices and in modern forms of ritual crime, like serial killing. Heated debates have been sparked over the causes of this fairly new phenomena. What is clear is that a more nuanced approach is needed, one which bridges understandings of the external and internal processes that encourage an individual transgressor to commit such crimes. Only then can we consider how the reflexive relationship we share with society influences existing, changing, and emerging forms of behavior, including ritual crime.